chief task in life is simply this: to identify and separate matters so that I can say clearly to myself which are externals, not under my control, and which have to do with the choices I actually control. Where then do I look for good and evil? Not to uncontrollable externals, but within myself to the choices that are my own." End quote. That's from Epictetus' Discourses, and it describes one of the fundamental principles of Stoic philosophy, the dichotomy of control. I think Stoicism is unique as a philosophy for living, in that it offers a number of practical techniques that any student can start applying. I want to focus on one of these Stoic techniques today. My name's Kiana, and you're listening to the very first episode of Will to Wisdom, a podcast exploring perspectives on living well. I'm going to talk about the Stoic practice of dividing the world into the things we control and the things we don't. Doing so will allow us to live with more purpose by focusing our attention on what really matters and not allowing ourselves to be disturbed by what doesn't. But before getting too deep into the dichotomy of control, let's provide some context and head back a couple thousand years in time. The Stoic school came into existence as a Hellenistic school of philosophy at around 300 BC. The Hellenistic Period refers to the period in Greek history between the death of Alexander the Great in 323 BC to the rise of the Roman Empire in 32 BC. During this time, a number of so-called schools of philosophy emerged in Athens. As well as the Stoic school, the Cynic school, which was influenced by Socrates, the Academy, which was started by Plato, and the Epicurean school all existed at around 300 BC. They together produced a sort of renaissance in philosophical thought, where students and teachers from each of the schools would take to the streets of Athens and challenge one another in public debate. The Stoic school was founded by Zeno of Citium and took some influence from Socrates and the Cynics. Zeno, before founding the Stoic school, was a successful merchant in the trade of fine dyes from distant lands. One day, on his travels, he became shipwrecked after drifting into a raging storm off the coast of Athens. With great fortune, Zeno's life was spared, but he lost his ship as well as his stock. Washed up, bedraggled, and penniless on the Athenian shoreline, with no means of getting back to Phoenicia where he was from, Zeno began wandering the streets of Athens. As many of us do when aimlessly walking around a foreign city, Zeno went into a bookshop. There he picked up a copy of Xenophon's Memorabilia and began reading. He was so taken by the depiction of Socrates therein that he immediately asked the bookseller where philosophers like Socrates can be found. Miraculously, at that very moment, Crates of Thebes, the most famous Cynic philosopher in Athens at that time, walked past the shop front. The bookseller, pointing after Crates, said, "Follow that man." And so, follow him Zeno did, for many years. As Crates' student, Zeno admired much of what the Cynics taught with respect to asceticism and the relationship between desire and well-being. But after some time, Zeno decided to leave Crates and the Cynics to see what wisdom some of the other schools of philosophy had to offer. He took residence for brief periods at smaller schools, such as the Megarian school and with the dialecticians, and over time Zeno became a formidable philosopher. Building on what he had learnt at the various schools, his own brand of philosophy began to emerge. By this point, Zeno figured it was about time to start teaching. He pitched up on a small painted porch in the Agora, or Market of Athens. The name of the porch in Greek was Stoa Poikile, and it's from this that Zeno and his many followers came to be known as the Stoics. All of the Hellenistic schools of philosophy would, to some extent or another, go on to affect the prevailing wisdom in the Roman world, but none to the same extent as the Stoics. Indeed, two of the three main figureheads of Stoic thought were themselves Romans, and the one who wasn't relocated to the empire early in his life. Let's introduce them. Seneca was born in 4 BC in Cordoba, Hispania, and was raised in Rome. There he was trained in rhetoric and philosophy, and in AD 49 became a tutor to Nero. When Nero became emperor in AD 54, Seneca became his lead advisor. Now, Granted, Nero did turn out to be a bit of a bastard, but please don't let that detail get in the way of you checking out Seneca's work. Anyway, Epictetus, whose passage we quoted at the beginning of the episode, was born a Greek slave in Hierapolis in 50 AD. He moved to Rome early in life and worked as a slave for a wealthy freedman and secretary to Nero. It's Epictetus's work, notably the Enchiridion and his discourses, which we'll be referring to most closely in this episode. Marcus Aurelius is probably my favourite of the three figureheads of Stoicism. Marcus was born in Rome in AD 121. He was the son of Marcus Verus, a distinguished Roman politician. Marcus went on to become one of the most well-regarded Roman emperors in history, with his reign lasting between 160 and 180 AD. His main contribution to the canon of Stoic thought is his meditations. They're like a personal diary, a collection of his private reflections and musings that were actually never meant for publication. They're an incredible insight into the mind of a practicing Stoic. Alright, so now that we've got a bit of a sense of who the Stoics are, let's go over some of the fundamental principles of Stoic thought. Zeno himself divided Stoic philosophy into three parts: logic, physics, and ethics. He offers the following analogy as a guide, describing philosophy as a garden, where logic functions as the protective fence, physics is represented by a tree within the garden, and ethics is the fruit that grows on the tree. In this sense, ethics is an emergent property of physics, which is an emergent property of logic. You can't know what it is to do the right action if you don't understand how the physical universe works, and you can't understand how the physical universe works if you don't understand how we arrive at truth through logical processes. The Stoics then believe that in order to be virtuous and to live well, a person must understand and apply each of the three categories of philosophy in their lives. Let's discuss briefly what each of Zeno's three categories are about. Stoic logic takes the same basic structure as the logic that is taught in philosophy departments to this day. It's concerned with the form of sound argument. The Stoic system of propositional logic was one of the two great systems of logic in the classical world. It differed from Aristotle's term logic in that it based its analysis on propositions rather than terms. Okay, I'm boring myself already, so we'll move on. We don't really need to talk about logic to understand the dichotomy of control, so I'll leave it there. We do need to talk about physics, though. Stoic physics, like physics today, is concerned with understanding the laws that govern the universe. Now, obviously, without having access to electron microscopes and hadron colliders or any scientific instruments at all, some of the Stoic findings look very different to those that physicists produce today. In any case, a crucial conclusion of Stoic physics, for the purposes of understanding the dichotomy of control, is that the universe operates fatalistically. We'll lean on Diogenes of Cynic fame for an overview of what this means. Quote, "The Stoics teach that God is unity, and that he is called mind and fate and Jupiter and by many other names besides. They say that all things are produced by fate. Fate is the connecting cause of existing things, or the reason to which the world is regulated." End quote. The Stoics, then, maintain that all events throughout the course of history are necessarily caused by previous events. These prior events are themselves caused by earlier events, all the way back to the beginning of time. This theory, in modern terms, is the theory of causal determinism. Events occur when they do because they're caused by prior events, and these prior events were themselves caused by events even earlier, and so on all the way back to the beginning of the universe and all the way forwards to the end of time. To put it another way, everything that occurs does so because it was fated to do so. Okay, hold that thought about fatalism while we talk about Stoic ethics. There are 2 points here that are important to mention before getting into the dichotomy of control. The first is that in order to live virtuously, a Stoic must live in accordance with nature. Now, they don't mean this in a sort of tree hugger or a hippie sense. No, to live in accordance with nature for a Stoic means to live in accordance with natural laws. Since human beings, like all animals, are products of nature, their lives are governed by the principles and laws of physics. As such, recognizing that the universe operates fatalistically and accepting the consequences of that is a first step in becoming an ethical Stoic.
But if the universe is fatalistic and all events are determined, then where's my free will?
Good question, my friend. A lack of free will would be massively problematic for the Stoics. They babble on about becoming more virtuous and seizing control of our minds. But how can we do that if we have no free will? If all of the actions that we take are simply a product of fate, then how can we be responsible for any of them? How can you or I live in accordance with nature if it's not fated for us to do so? Well, despite arguing that the universe is fatalistic, the Stoics still believe that we have free will. In fact, they are early compatibilists. They believe that it's possible to reconcile free will and a deterministic universe. For the Stoics, fate controls everything external to the minds of human beings. This includes the weather, the orbits of the planets, and all natural events. But fate does not control completely what happens within the minds of humans. It's not that our minds defy the natural order of things. Fate sets only the general conditions for how nature operates, but does not micromanage how our thoughts unfold within our minds. Cicero, another Roman who is heavily influenced by Stoicism, explained this idea with the following analogy. Quote, "It's like a man who, pushing a cylinder, gives it a principle of motion, but not immediately that of revolution. Similarly, an object strikes our sense and conveys its image to our mind, yet leaves us free to form our specific sentiment concerning it." End quote. In other words, external events which are out of our control produce perceptions or impressions in our minds. Though we don't have control over the arisal of the impressions themselves, we do have control over how we react to them. We use the impressions as well as our reactions to them to, over time, build minds and characters of our own. According to the Stoics, it's through this mechanism that we can find our free will. With this in mind, we finally come on to the dichotomy of control, that to be virtuous and to live happily, we need to modify our attitude to the things we cannot control. Let's return to the original quote from Epictetus to see if things are starting to fall into place a little more now. Quote, "The chief task in life is simply this, to identify and separate matters so that I can say clearly to myself which are externals not under my control and which have to do with the choices I actually control." End quote. Can we see now how the dichotomy as presented by Epictetus fits into the Stoic view of free will in a fatalistic universe? Epictetus says, "Identify and separate matters so that I can say to myself which are externals and not in my control." External meaning outside of the mind. So the Stoics believe that we only have control over some things internal to our minds. What does this really mean? Epictetus provides us an answer in the very first passage of his Enchiridion. Quote, "Some things are in our control and others not. Things in our control are opinion, pursuit, desire, aversion, and, in a word, whatever are our own actions. Things not in our control are body, property, reputation, command, and, in a word, whatever are not our own actions." End quote. So, amongst the actions that we control, Epictetus lists opinion, pursuit, desire, and aversion. Let's take a look at each of these. By opinion, Epictetus simply means the positions we hold on certain matters. The Stoics believe the power to change our opinion based on evidence is something we have absolute control over. Indeed, for the Stoics, to be guided by reason rather than sentiment is a key virtue. By pursuit, Epictetus means the goals we set for ourselves. The Stoics argue that we must be careful to set goals whose achievement are within our control. Say you want to be a professional writer. Simply telling yourself that your goal is to write professionally isn't a good approach according to the Stoics. This is because you don't control all of the factors that go into achieving such a broad and ambitious goal. For one thing, people have to like reading your books or news articles or survival guides or whatever it is that you write. For another, your writing has to be seen by the right people at the right times for it to be picked up by a publisher. Because so much of this goal lies outside of our control, we risk becoming dejected and abandoning the goal altogether if things don't go our way. Instead, the Stoics suggest that we should analyze the task of becoming a writer and divide it into the aspects which we control and those which we don't. Then we should align our goals with only those aspects over which we actually have control. One aspect of becoming a writer that we control is, well, writing. So it'd be a good idea to set the goal of writing for 2 hours a day, for example, or one article a week, instead of just becoming a writer. Another aspect we control is marketing ourselves and our brand. Instead of making our goal to pick up a publisher, make it to reach out to 2 potential publishers a week, or to attend a relevant networking event or conference per month. By setting goals that don't rely on things external to us to be achieved, we'll have a much greater chance of actually achieving them. This has a double benefit. First, we increase our own level of personal satisfaction and tranquility by actually achieving what we set out to. And second, we improve our chances of actually achieving the bigger ambition of becoming a writer, because we're getting on with doing what writers do, instead of worrying about all the scary uncontrollables that go into any self-directed career. Also, remembering the fatalistic nature of the universe, a practicing Stoic will recognize and accept the fact that there will always be some level of luck involved in actually becoming a successful writer. By accepting that, she's far less likely to be negatively affected if it doesn't work out, despite pouring a lot of time and energy into it. Okay, so Epictetus also includes desire as something we control as well. This one's really important to the Stoics because of their recognition that a major impediment to human happiness is our insatiability. We spend a great deal of time and effort working to get what we want. Then, after some time, our desires change. We become bored with the products, relationships, and career positions that were once at the forefront of our yearning. This phenomenon is called Hedonic Adaptation. The lottery is a great illustration of hedonic adaptation in action. Winning the lottery allows people to live the lives of their dreams, but for many winners, after a period of exaltation, they return to a similar level of happiness that they experienced beforehand. They take their new Porsche and Seaview mansion for granted, just as they did their rusted banger and cramped apartment previously. Obviously, not all of us win the lottery, but I'm certain that we've all experienced hedonic adaptation in one form or another. We might work hard to afford a new smartphone, or a guitar in my case, only to find that a year down the line, we're bored of them. By learning to prevent our taking for granted the things which we work so hard to attain, we're more likely to nurture a long-lasting gratefulness for even the most basic things in our possession. The Stoics are suggesting that we need to employ our powers of control over our desires. We need to reflect on every new desire that pops into our heads and decide whether this is something that we really need. We need to take conscious steps to do away with the misguided notion that links happiness with the satisfaction of material desire. Seneca covers this in one of his letters. Quote, "Nature's wants are slight, but the demands of opinion are boundless. Suppose that the property of many millionaires is heaped up in your possession. Assume that fortune carries you far beyond the limits of a private income, decks you with gold and clothes you in purple. You will only learn from such things to crave still greater." End quote. This was true in ancient Rome, but it's especially true now. Product marketing is inextricably linked with insights from psychology and behavioral science. Marketers use massive streams of consumer data to present you the right products at the right times, essentially gaming the ancient wiring of your mind. For this reason, the Stoics' recommendation to seriously and consciously examine your desire as it arises is especially pertinent. Alright, so the last thing that Epictetus lists as within our control is aversion. This essentially amounts to the avoidance of things that we don't desire. In the end, the Stoic advice is the same. We need to modify our aversions to those things we have control over avoiding. As Aurelius notes, nothing is worth doing pointlessly, and a prime example of this is the extent to which humans worry about avoiding events which are out of our control. I used to do this with exams. After completing my exams at school, it would take a number of weeks for our results to come back. I'd spend a lot of this time racked with angst, worrying about whether or not I'd achieved a passing grade. This kind of worry with respect to the outcome of an exam, when I no longer had any power to affect it, would seem completely irrational to a Stoic. Epictetus sums up how we should be thinking about desire and aversion in a later passage of the Enchiridion. Quote, "The faculty of desire purports to aim at securing what you want. If you fail in your desire, you're unfortunate. If you experience what you'd rather avoid, you're unhappy. For desire, suspend it completely for now, because if you desire something outside of your control, you're bound to be disappointed. And even things we do control, which under other circumstances would be deserving of our desire, are not yet within our power to attain." End quote. If we were to distill all of what we've been speaking about into a single principle, it's this. We have in our control only the power to deal with impressions. As we move through life, we experience a constant barrage of impressions to our senses. Sights, sounds, smells, memories, or thoughts rising up from nowhere. These impressions are usually linked with an automated judgment. Someone cuts you off as you're driving, and automatically the thought, "What an arsehole," pops into your mind. This process is happening at all times, from the moment we wake in the morning to the moment we rest our heads at night. We have absolutely no control over the arisal of these impressions and snap judgments, but we do have control over how we deal with them. Dealing with impressions in the correct way is what constitutes virtue and wisdom in the eyes of the Stoics. This is an incredible insight to me, because the Stoic reasoning that we've been speaking about today demonstrates to us exactly when we can intervene, using our powers of control, to veto an impression or judgment or action that's not good for us. In the case of the arsehole who cut us off, we might reframe the situation by telling ourselves that the driver must have been in a hurry for some important reason, or by reflecting on the fact that someone cutting us off actually makes no difference to the length of our journey. Once I started really examining my thoughts and judgments as they arose, I noticed how much of what affects my mood is a result of automated responses to stimuli whose appearance in my mind I didn't control. Now, this kind of constant examination of our impressions, it's not easy, and it's a skill that takes a lot of time and effort to cultivate. But I've found that by just recognizing the fact that a lot of our general mood is determined by events that happen to us, which are out of our control, I've begun to reflect naturally on my impressions. And in doing so, I think I've become more resilient to the sometimes cruel whims of fate. I think it's important to add that this kind of mindful self-examination of our conscious thoughts is not unique to Stoicism. It features heavily in a lot of Eastern and in particular Buddhist thought. Those similarities, in fact, might make for an interesting future episode. Anyway, I think I've rambled on enough for today. There's certainly more to discuss when it comes to Stoicism and the dichotomy of control, but for now, thank you so much for joining me for the very first episode of Will to Wisdom. I really hope you've enjoyed it, and I'll leave you with a less than gracious description of the average human mind from our man Epictetus. Quote, "Our desires are inflamed, our aversions are low, our purposes are inconsistent, our motives are out of harmony with nature, and our opinions are ill-considered and mistaken." End quote. Well, shit. We'd better get to work, friend. As always, I'll link to any further reading on the transcript to this episode, which can be found at willtowisdompod.com. There, you'll also be able to subscribe to my mailing list to ensure that you don't miss an episode. Since I'm just starting out in the podcast world, I would absolutely love to receive your feedback. In particular, I'd like to know what you think of the format. Do you think there was too much on the origins and history of Stoicism, or do you find that kind of context useful? If you'd like to reach out with feedback, questions, or even just to say hello, then you can do so via email at kiana@willtowisdompod.com. That's KEYANA@willtowisdompod.com. Finally, if you enjoy the show, please leave a rating or review wherever it is that you're listening. I'm told that this really helps to grow the show. Anyway, thank you again for listening, and I'll see you next time.